Our guest today is Heather Boesch. Educated as both an economist and an architect, Heather serves as a liaison between IDEO designers and clients on operational matters and is deeply involved in IDEO's public sector practice. If there is a business whose practice perfectly embodies the goals of this course, it is IDEO. Prior to joining the firm, she spent 2 years living in the Middle East while serving as the director of operations for a trucking company run by tribal sheiks that endeavored to bring economic relief to communities adversely affected by war, and simultaneously co-founded New World Design, a collective of designers working on humanitarian projects in post-war Iraq, including potable drinking water dissemination networks, wheelchair distribution, transportation infrastructure, mobile medical services, and affordable housing constructed from U.S. military refuse. Heather has also worked as a research analyst at McKinsey, as a member of the education team at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, and as part of a core team that launched a specialized air cargo shuttle service using decommissioned U.S. Air Force jets that transformed the supply chain logistics of industrial projects in the world's most remote locations. She holds a BA with honors in economics from Harvard and an MA in architecture from the Graduate School of Design. Please join me in welcoming Heather Boesch.
I'm going to kind of stand in front of this podium so I can see. I also have a bit of a cold, so I'll do my best to project, but you'll have to forgive me. So I'm Heather. I'm from IDEO. It doesn't stand for anything, and it's hard to pronounce. You're supposed to punch the I, IDEO, is the way to say it. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are, for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, the process that we go through, and a little bit at the end of kind of what life is like there. So IDEO considers itself a human-centered design consultancy, and our goal is to create impact in the world through design. That means that we're designers, but we're also consultants. We don't design for ourselves, we design for our clients. And they come to us with some of the world's smallest problems and some of the world's biggest problems. And we apply a methodology gleaned from creative practice to try and solve these business problems. We're also known for having a lot of really interesting people with very diverse backgrounds. So we have 11 studios around the world. There's about 600 to 700 of us at any time. And we come from a very diverse range. We have a philosophy that if you put a lot of people with very similar backgrounds in the room, that they'll come to answers that are very similar to what you already have. But if you put people with very different backgrounds in a room, you might get some different and more interesting answers, and they can build upon each other's experience and ideas. So even in our Boston studio, we have about 60 people there, and we have, all of these disciplines represented. We have mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, product designers, industrial designers, motion graphics designers, videographers, communication designers, MBAs, the whole kind of range of people. So what do we try to do? We say we help organizations achieve disruptive innovation. Innovation is a word that is used a lot in business now and has started to become meaningless. But the way that we kind of define it is finding solutions that are at the intersection of these three spheres or lenses. So human desirability, what people want, what's technically feasible, and what's viable economically from a business perspective. And you kind of have to achieve all three of those things. What makes IDEO a little bit different is that we always enter from the sphere of human desirability, thinking about what people actually want. And that's one of the reasons why, there's probably something in all of your homes that has been designed by IDEO, but you wouldn't be able to recognize it because we don't have an aesthetic or a look. We kind of meet with people, we try to understand them deeply and figure out what they need. So if you're thinking about, an example, a lot of businesses start from the other side, like technical feasibility or business viability. An example of something like that is, say, like the Segway, right? It was like technologically possible, and they could make it at a good profit, but no one actually wanted it, right? So it wasn't that successful. So one of the ways that we kind of get this diverse group of people to work together on projects is we follow a process. Now, sometimes it has 5 circles, and sometimes it has 3, and I'm pretty sure you're learning some variation of this process in the class. The way that I've broken it down now is across these 4 buckets, and I'll go into each of them in a little bit more detail about what we need, but we can pretty much apply this to any project. And they also intersect because it's not linear. You kind of go back and forth across this, trying to observe what's happening in the world, what people need, trying to understand how that might translate to a larger population outside of a single person, starting to design solutions against those opportunities, and then kind of testing and iterating. And you might have to go all the way back to the beginning at a point. And we kind of call this design thinking, and I think we coined the term. So we do that in order to do this, right? To design experiences with people at the center. And they're across a range of expressions. So think people at the middle, and you want them to experience something. Maybe it's delight, maybe it's surprise, maybe it's respect, I don't know, some type of emotional response that they want to have. And then there are particular items or touch points that you're designing to evoke those emotional responses, and they can be products or services or spaces or businesses. And then at the higher level, there's kind of systems that support these things being able to exist in the world, and we'll work across all of those phases. So I've thrown up a couple examples of the range of different kinds of touch points that get designed by the same group of people to show it's not traditional product design. A lot of people think about it that way because that's where we started. If you look in the upper left, we designed the first computer mouse about 20 years ago for Apple and the first laptop. So our roots were in product design. And it was about 10 years ago that they started to realize that this process that they apply to product design is actually applicable to a whole range of things. So these are examples of kind of how we define products these days. So we still do a lot of products. We'll do a lot of medical products. That's a vaccine that doesn't need a needle, e-readers. We'll do a lot of digital products too, right? This is the interface for the new Wells Fargo ATMs to try and make that more intuitive to use. Most of you are probably too young to have children here, but the number 1 app that's in the App Store, it's called Call Elmo, where Elmo will call your child and tell them to brush their teeth at a certain hour. And we'll also design services. So a kind of famous example of this is the Keep the Change program from Bank of America. And they were like, how do we get more people to want to have savings accounts, right? So we're trying to unpack what are the emotions that get people to kind of feel connected and good about themselves with relation to money, and then how can we design services that draw that out of people. A lot of things for schools. We'll do a lot of online service education. That's with Capella University. A few examples. We also design a lot of spaces. I am an architect. We have architects here. And this can be a range of things. The one on the right are homes for wounded warriors that we designed with Clark Realty, because most universal design is often making kind of homes that are just for people that are handicapped. But we are trying to design them for what's the emotional needs of a family that may have one disabled person in it. This one on the right, the lower left, is a new pharmacy experience at Walgreens, right? They have their most expensive employees are their pharmacists, and they sit them behind a counter. So even things just like bringing them out from behind the counter, trying to design those interactions that happen in those spaces. And then we'll take it all the way to the level of systems. At the upper right is Inova Schools. We've actually designed an entire school system in Peru that was financed by Carlos Slim, because you either had terrible public schools or very, very expensive private schools. So he asked us to design a school system that people could attend for $100 a month. And we designed the curriculum, the online tools, the business model by which it works, the building that it's in, right? All of those things we kind of consider aspects of design. We'll work a lot in the third world on the lower right. Yes, I mix up my lefts and rights. That's a sanitation service in Ghana to kind of get people to use toilets, basically. We'll work a lot in the government, too. On the upper left, it's how do we inform people about the different ways that they can get screened for colon cancer and maybe encourage them to actually do it. So this is the process that we use to do all of these things, this huge range of things, right? So I'm going to walk us through it a little bit and give you kind of some techniques, I guess, by how we do what we do. one thing that I want to say at the beginning, and this I think is an important point throughout this process, which is that there's a natural tendency to, as you kind of create ideas, to self-edit those ideas. And one thing that we take very seriously and that we think is important to this process of design is to separate the time that you're creating choices and the time that you're making choices. Because the time that you're creating choices, those self-editing instincts are really hindering you, because it's very easy to be negative. It's very easy to find reasons why you can't do something or shouldn't do something, even before it's a fully fleshed idea. But a lot of times in those ideas you might have initially rejected, there's a kernel that can be developed that is actually really interesting. So we try to be very rigorous about which portions of the process we're creating choices, we're being expansive, we're generating as many as possible. That doesn't mean that we never judge those things, but there is a time in which we make choices and we do judge those things. But we don't do them at the same time, which is what you're kind of naturally brought up to do. So if you map this across the process, this is how it's kind of working. We're creating choices at the beginning by observing people. We're trying to understand those observations and then making choices. Then we're creating choices again based on those understandings. How do we create actual designs that come from that? And then when we're testing them, we're making those choices again. So I'm going to focus in this on the kind of areas in which we're generating choices, because I think that's kind of what IDEO is most known for. So the first thing that we do in any project is try to observe people. What's really happening? What's motivating people's behaviors? What are pain points that people have? What interesting workarounds have they created? And also, what can we observe from outside the world that might be totally different? And we usually will spend about a month at the beginning of any project doing this. So the way that we do this, I've kind of separated it into mindsets and methods. So I think about it like methods are things that can be learned. They're kind of techniques that you can do. And mindsets are kind of things that have to be earned, right? They're a way of thinking that applies across all of these things. Because you can do the methods, but if you aren't in the right headspace for them, you're not going to get as much out of them, right? So here I'll start with some mindsets. So one of them is to cultivate empathy. We definitely think about ourselves as an empathetic organization. And the reason for this is because when you're out in the field and you're looking at people, it's, again, very easy to judge those things. Be like, oh, that person just didn't read the instructions right, and that's why they're doing it wrong. Or, I've told them enough, like they just didn't understand, right? When you actually try to put yourself in that person's shoes and really have empathy, their behavior is probably coming from a positive place. And you're not going to discover what's holding them back if you don't actually try to understand that from a positive perspective. Whoops. Another thing is we call active looking. And this is just how you kind of peek out for observations in the world. So, here, this is also an example of being empathetic. You could look at this and you could say that, people are kind of jerks. They're just leaving their trash everywhere on the subway, right? Or you could look at this and you could think, they really need a trash can here, right? That's a design solution that could come from this, that comes from a more positive place rather than a negative place. Whoops. Does not want to go on that slide. This is an example of how you might see a workaround, right? So we go and we interview people, but in many ways talking to them is the least important thing that we do. And you'll kind of notice things, right? So the fact that someone has done this is oh, they probably have a problem where they're unplugging things and other things are going off, right? That's an opportunity for a design solution. So when people have kind of tried to do things to fix stuff that's a problem in their world, but in a hack-together way, we love seeing that, because there's usually a way that we can bring that into a design solution. And this one's kind of thinking about how the choices that we make create unintentional behaviors, and once we observe those, maybe we can make those intentional choices, right? So that yellow track down the middle is, to help people that are blind find their way. You can see everyone's kind of using it differently. This man is walking along it, kind of having a moment of delight. People have walked in different directions around it, it created a street. Right? None of those things were intentional when they created that, but that's how people have behaved around it. And that's what we're trying to observe while we're in the field. So the last kind of mindset that we should bring to this research is what we call, looking at the nonverbal. Because, there's what people say, and you can ask them what they say, but we think that's very different from what people do, which is also different from what they think, which might also be different from what they feel. And so there are lots of clues that you can look for in people that can kind of evidence those things. For example, if you're trying to test a software program and someone is using it, like don't look at the screen, look at their face, right? And when they start to like cringe a little bit, like that's probably an area that you could address or that you could make better. So let's think about some methods that we use. And these are pretty tactical things that you can do whenever you're starting a project that you're trying to find a real problem in the world. So one is being observational. So we'll never have people into the office and ask them, what they think they are. We'll always go to their homes. We always go in context into their homes to try and find out how they actually live with things. So this is an example from a woman who was about 85 years old, and it was a project on packaging for an arthritis medication. And the people on our team, they're all in their 20s, and even they had difficulty opening this bottle. It's really, really tiny. So they were at this woman's house, and they were like, how do you find taking your medication? Like, is it hard to get into it? Asking them these questions. She's like, no, it's super easy. Like, I have no problems with it at all. And that was kind of surprising. So they're like, well, can you show us like what you do when you take medication? And so then they walked into her kitchen, and she sliced the top off with an industrial meat slicer. Right? And she's like shaking, and there's like a whirring blade going around. Everyone's a little bit scared she's going to chop off her finger, right? But that's like the kind of thing you don't get in a survey result, where she's like, no, it's cool. Like, I figured it out. Experiential. This is often the fun part about the design. We really try and get in people's shoes. So, this was, they were asking us to design board shorts for surfers, right? So we took the whole team, we rented an RV van, and they spent 4 weeks on the coast of California learning how to surf and hanging out with surfers to try and figure out, what is that lifestyle really like? What do you really need? So we'll often kind of like get, really in the weeds and try and experience what the people we're designing for are experiencing. This is another example of an experiential kind of prototype. So we were working on a hospital, emergency room. They wanted to think about their emergency room experience. So we had one of a guy just like tape a camera to his head, this is pre-GoPro, and check himself into the emergency room. So he checked himself in and he filmed it. And then we showed that footage to the executives at the hospital. And that footage was 8 hours of staring at the ceiling while people talked over you. Right? And it was incredibly boring. And they're like, can we stop watching this? And we're like, no, because this is what people are actually experiencing when they're going through this hospital room. Just like looking here and people saying stuff over them and pretending that they're not even there. Right? And that was kind of very eye-opening to them about how you kind of interact with patients in a hospital environment. Another kind of third method that we'll use is called analogous research. And this is thinking about metaphors for what we're trying to do. So in this project, it was about communication in the surgical rooms, about reducing surgical error among surgery teams. That's Stacy up at the front. So we watched a lot of surgeries. But if you think about that environment, like when you abstract it, what does that environment really is? Well, it's a high-pressure environment. It's life or death. There's teams of people communicating with kind of specialized tools. They're on a fast time schedule. So like, what is that like, right? So we took all the surgeons and had them watch a NASCAR pit crew for the day, right? Because they have very similar things. People are coming in, they have 3 minutes, they can't speak to each other, they got to figure out, and a lot of things that they had come up with as workarounds turned out to be really applicable even to the surgery environment. So, for example, they have every type of problem pre-identified in the pit crew, and they'll have a pack for that. So they might have 19 drills, but because there's one in each pack, right? Where in the surgical environment, there's one of each tool, and they're kind of trying to pull them aside. So even just stuff like reorganizing things around problems, was able to reduce surgical error in this environment by like 25 or 30%. The last kind of method, we'll talk about here, the fourth one, is to look at extremes. So when you're trying to design for something, a lot of times people want to design for like the most people. Like I want to design something that lots of people will buy. So I'm going to like aim for that middle part, right? And we actually think, there's a time to do that. And that's when you already have an idea and you're trying to validate that lots of people like it. But when you're trying to get inspired at the beginning of a design process, we actually find it much more interesting to look at the edges. So an example of this is, we were designing a set of kitchen tools, right? And most of the people that use them are going to be like, moms cooking dinner for their families, like, parents. But we were thinking, what's the extreme examples of that, right? So extreme users of this is a professional chef and like a 3-year-old that's learning to cook, right? And if we can design a tool that both of them can actually use, we've probably already solved for all those people in the middle. And those people have much more interesting challenges that create constraints that you can design against. So we'll usually aim for the edges. If we're doing a finance project, we'll try and find someone that never uses cash, has an all-digital wallet, and someone that doesn't even have a savings account or something like that, and kind of compare their behaviors for inspiration. So we'll spend a lot of time in the field. We'll gather all of these observations. We take a lot of pictures. We record a lot of videos. We put them all up in our room and look at them. And then we try to make sense out of them. And I'll kind of go through this a little quicker, because this is the more analytical portion, I guess, when you're trying to uncover themes from all of this evidence that you have. But you're trying to think, how can we categorize behaviors? What explains why people are acting in that way? How do we map the journeys that people are making and look for opportunities within them, and then find the ones that are the most important? And the one kind of tip I'll give here is that it's a very natural tendency to go immediately from observations to solutions, right? And to be like, I saw this one thing with this one person, and I can create something that fixes it, right? But ultimately, we are trying to create something that works for lots of people. So we actually kind of do this a little bit more. So you can see it's concrete on the bottom, and then it gets more abstract as you go up. So we'll take those observations. For example, in the Bank of America case, the observation that we made was there was this woman who, she was rounding up all of her utility bills. When we watched her pay her bills, she was rounding them up to the nearest dollar. And we're like, why would you pay more money than you owe, right? That's a totally non-rational economic behavior. And she's like, well, I like to feel like I'm always getting ahead, like at the end of the year, like they owe me something and I don't owe them something, right? So when we looked at that behavior, we're like, how do we kind of derive an insight from that behavior and then think about it as a framework? And what we noticed across a range of people was that it wasn't actually even like the amount that people were putting aside or saving that made them feel good. It was the frequency by which they were doing it, right? So that was the kind of behavioral observation that we made. So we're like, let's try to design a program where you're always constantly saving, even if it's like a penny here and there, because it'll make people feel really good, right? And 20 million more people signed up for savings accounts. But we kind of tried to abstract that and then think about, what are principles that we can use to design around? Well, try and inject a moment of saving as often as possible. That might be a principle. And then we'll try and design concepts around it and test it. So we try to kind of go abstract before we go concrete again. So I'm going to kind of group these two together in the interest of time, because they are kind of fluid, where you design things, you test them, you iterate them. We'll often call it a sprint. We'll do it in 3 weeks, a week to design, a week to test, a week to iterate. And this is, we've identified some opportunities. We've noticed some things in the field. We have some ideas of what problems need to be solved. So let's just start creating ideas, right? So this is where we create choices again. How do we come up with touch points, with products, with tools, with services that can address this? How can we prototype them in cheap and fast ways? And then how does that get refined based on feedback in the field? And we'll do very similar types of research we did at the beginning. We'll go back into people's homes with these prototypes and show them to them. So this, again, we're in a place where we're creating choices here. So for this one, I'm going to go in the opposite order. I'm going to talk about some tactics first that we use to create choices, and then I'm going to talk about mindset. So, one of the choices, one of the things that we should always do when you're in this design phase and you're looking at the piece of paper, is you set a time limit for yourself and you go for quantity. You do not go for quality. There's been numerous behavioral studies that show if you take kind of one group and you tell them to come up with the best answer, and you have another group and you tell them to come up with as many answers as they can, inevitably the group that you told to come up with as many answers as possible also comes up with the best answer. It kind of helps get you out of that self-judgmental mindset. So you're always going for quality. You might say quantity. You might be like, can we get 100 Post-its on the board at the end of this 5 minutes? And it doesn't matter how ridiculous they are. The other thing we say is to defer judgment. This is kind of the creating choices, making choices. there's always reasons why like you cannot do something. And we think about the ideas as like little baby turtles on the sand, and they have to get to the ocean. And if you kill them when they are a baby turtle, they will not get to the ocean. So there might be something kind of that sounds crazy or wild, and we'll actually encourage those ideas. We'll be like, there aren't enough weird ideas on this board yet. Let's come up with like some weird stuff. And then we'll defer judgment to a later point in the process. Another thing is, a philosophy of kind of think to build and build to think. We don't like there to be a time where we really like sit around thinking about what the answer should be and then we go make it. We kind of do those things at the same time, and you do them like really, really fast and rapid. So when we're designing interfaces for things, it's not like we code them or even put them in interactive PDFs to start with. Like we put them on Post-its and then we have people pretend that they're real. Or we cut up a bunch of pieces of paper and we say, how would you arrange these on a page? We try and do it as quickly and as cheaply as possible, and that way you can learn things as you're doing it, as opposed to trying to figure it out before. The last one is the idea of kind of failing early to succeed sooner, which there's a lot of reasons for doing this. One of them is that if you have an idea and then you develop it and maybe you spend a lot of money developing a prototype, if once you test that thing you find out that it doesn't work, you've kind of wasted a lot of time and money, right? The other thing is the more investment that you put into something before you've started to kind of test it out with people, the more emotionally attached you get to it. You're like, this was like my idea, right? But when you're just writing a thing on a Post-it and someone doesn't like it, you're like, great, tear that one up, write a new one. Like you're not that emotionally invested in the solution. So an example of how this kind of plays out is we're designing like a long-haul flight experience for Air New Zealand, right? Because they have these 20-hour flights. And you're like, how do we make the kind of non-first class experience better for when you're on these 20-hour flights? I think at the top is the eventual design solution. But you can see at the bottom, this is kind of how we actually prototyped it. And you can immediately come up with observations that you might have otherwise missed. So like what you might do traditionally is like make a model airplane shell and actually try and like build some of these things. But we were like, okay, like let's think about what we might want. One thing people are always jealous of is like you get to lie all the way down, right, in first class or business class. So you get to recline. So we're like, well, what if everybody got to recline? What if you had like bunk beds, right? So everybody got to lie down and sleep on the plane. So we could have like built that. But instead, we just took the project team and we stacked a bunch of chairs on top of each other until they were like about the right height, and then we all got in it. And we like quickly found that this was a terrible idea. That like it was super uncomfortable, and you didn't feel great being that close to someone, and it seemed weird, and you felt kind of like you were in a coffin. So we could like immediately reject that idea with like $0 and 5 minutes, even though it might have seemed like a really interesting, like innovative thing we could try to do. All right, so we'll kind of just roll through lots and lots of those as quickly as we can. So this is kind of the mindset of this section. So those are like things you can do. You can set yourself rules, right, when you have a brainstorm. You can be like, go for quantity, defer judgment, build upon the ideas of others. You can make these rules and execute brainstorms. But how do you actually come up with like good ideas, right? And so we've evolved a type of thinking that we like to call creative confidence. We actually wrote a book on it this year, which is why this is the book cover. Tom and David Kelly, who are the founders of IDEO, have written it. And it's about the idea that pretty much everyone is creative. And a lot of our own self-limiting just comes from the things that we've told ourselves. Like if you couldn't draw in like 7th grade, they were like, you're bad at art, so then you've decided you're not a creative person, right? And that just fundamentally isn't true, right? There's the ability to kind of create and generate ideas in everyone, but it's kind of like it's a little bit like a muscle that you have to exercise it. And so how do you draw that out of you? And how do you start to undo all of those things that, you said about yourself? And even me, like I didn't think I was a very creative person. I was an economist, right? And a mathematician. And, but it turns out that I was, right? I just told myself that a lot. And then I was like, what kind of things does it unlock if you stop telling yourself those things? Like you're creating self-fulfilling prophecies. So we've started to create a kind of philosophy around how do we draw out people's creative confidence in any situation, because we really believe that design has a role to play in like most problems that you're trying to solve. So yeah, we kind of think about it like riding a bike, right? The first time you rode the bike, you fell off. And you probably fell off a bunch of times, and then one day you didn't fall off, right? And it was kind of slowly building up your confidence until you were just going, right? And so how do you kind of start to slowly build up that confidence so that you can go? So here's like a way you don't do it that we always think is hilarious. We take pictures of these in all of our clients' rooms. Because they'll make like a creative thinking room. Like when I'm like over here, I'm like not creative, but when I'm over here, I'm super creative, right? And they'll just fill it with like whiteboards and Post-it notes, and they'll be like, this is the spot that we're creative. But it's not really something like you turn on and off like that. You kind of need to build it into the culture of your organization and make it okay for this to be a way of thinking that people do. So one of the ways that we do that, which always seems really silly to people, is we do something every Thursday that we call Masterclass, which is basically an exercise of design fiction. And it seems a lot like the kind of things you might have done in like craft class, when you were in elementary school, but it's just a way of kind of exercising those creative muscles regularly. And everyone does it, from like our front desk staff to our managing directors. And it's just kind of playful. You don't put your name on it. No one looks at it later. You're just kind of creating things. And it's a way to exercise that outside of maybe a really specific client problem that's more limiting. So, these are some examples of ones we've done. I think we're going to put a book out of it. This was like Demented Toys, right, where we went to the thrift store next door and we bought 100 toys and people had to take them apart and like switch them inside out and move the stuffing and make a series of demented toys. Oh, this one was Dream Catchers of the Future, right? It doesn't mean anything. We just like ate pizza and played with cardboard. But just like doing these kinds of things where you had reconnecting with that freedom that you had can start to spill over into other areas. I think this is actually the one David Kelly made. He was in for lunch that day. He was one of our founders. So it feels really self-indulgent and kind of silly, but it really isn't. It's kind of critical to maintaining a sense of creative flow as you do these kind of more challenging and heady types of problems. So I was going to walk through one example at the end, and then we'll kind of finish it up. Because we do have this process, right? And you can follow the process and you can do the rules. But I also don't want to, make you believe that it is some very vigorous process, that you can simply just apply this vigorous process and you will come out of the end with like innovative ideas. And when you're working with designers, it does get a little messy. So I wanted to give a kind of real life example of how a kind of wild creativity and a client-driven problem can kind of inform each other in a way. So we'll get a little weird. So this was a pharmaceutical project for a company called Sanofi, and they were releasing a drug for diabetes management. And it was a really difficult challenge. The drug was fourth to market. It didn't have any particular advantages to the other drugs on the market. You had to differentiate it through a kind of service experience. And we put a team of people on here, none of whom had ever worked on a pharmaceutical project or had any idea what they were talking about. So, Anne on the left, she was a documentary filmmaker. She used to be a producer for Arthur on PBS. The guy in the middle has an MBA. The guy on the right, Matt Brown, is like a kind of industrial designer and fine artist who makes like crazy synthesizers. So we just put them in a room. We're like, this is going to be the team. It's funny, people ask us, and they'll be like, well, what are you an expert in? And we're like, well, we're an expert in nothing, right? Because the idea of like bringing fresh eyes to something is usually what comes up with new types of solutions. So this was like a pretty heavy project, right? This is the first part. They're in their observe bubble, right? They probably interviewed 80 people. And these are people that have just been diagnosed with an illness they're going to have for their whole life, right? It's really emotional talking to all of these people. And it really affects the team too, right? Like you get kind of sad and very wrapped up in it when you're talking to all of these people. But you're still trying to drive empathy and positivity and kind of come out of that. So they developed a bunch of structures to kind of help them balance this. First they were just trying to understand, right? They're not experts. So, Nick, one of the communication designers on the project, just made this poster. Because he was like, how does the pancreas work? But he used to own a punk rock poster company in Chattanooga, Tennessee, right? He's not a doctor. So he, in order to kind of figure out how the science works, he made himself these series of posters on the pancreas, right? It wasn't part of the project, but it helped get him to connect to it in a way that he could start to apply creativity to it. And this is actually the project table from the room. And there was a lot of very long phone calls in which people would use like very long drug names. And so people just started drawing on the table as a kind of creative outlet. And they actually started to develop a kind of whole mythology, basically, around this. So one of the competitive drugs was called like Degludec. And so they thought that sounded like kind of like an evil king somewhere. So they started to make, you can see there's all these like creatures in here. They started to make this universe around like Degludec, who was this monster that they were battling. Well, they actually they made a song about him, which I would play if I was better at multimedia. They kind of did this whole thing. And as they created this world, they started to think about the idea of ritual, right? Because ultimately what they were creating is a kit that helps people use their diabetes medication better. But what you're really doing there, when you start to abstract it into a framework, is you're helping people create rituals that they'll follow. And so what does that mean, and how do you kind of become empathetic to that? So lots of people on the team tried to do things, that required kind of daily ritual, but were life-changing. One of the guys quit smoking. Somebody decided to be vegan for the entire project, or go to the gym every day. Try and come up with analogies to the situation of what these people were facing when they first learned they had to start taking this diabetes medication, but actually legitimately feel it, right? Because it's hard, right? It's hard to quit smoking. It's hard to do those kinds of things. So they started to develop these rituals and these mythologies, and there was an altar on the other side of the room, but I'm not going to show it. But so all that kind of stuff was going on. You can be like, well, that doesn't really seem like they're working on the pharmaceutical project. But they actually were, right? At the same time, they're creating all of these prototypes. They're rolling through all of these things. But that's like an outlet that helps them maintain creative flow over the course of what's like a 6 to 10 month project, which otherwise can get really dry and emotional and kind of sad. So they made these things the whole time, and they made lots of prototypes. These are kind of how they went. Some of them went nowhere, some of them went all the way to the end. And in the end, they ended up designing this kind of thing. And there's no monsters on it, right? It looks like this, and it won a Medical Design Gold Award last year. And it was based around kind of the idea that when you get diagnosed with diabetes, you don't really hear anything after that. You don't hear all the other stuff your doctor tells you. You just hear your diagnosis, and then you're done. So we're like, how do we start to layer information so that, here's what you need for week 1. This is all don't worry about anything else. Worry about week 1, right? And then kind of start to get into it. And so we kind of created this layered kit, and it's out in the market now. And it actually really challenged the FDA even on how they allow kind of instructions to be made, right? And they're all kind of layered back behind that in different ways. But the team is really committed the whole time. I mean, I ended on this. Nick got a tattoo of Degludec's hand, right, at the end of the project. They really kind of get involved in these kind of creative fictions that help keep you going while you're going through this process, which might involve things that are very hard and things that are very challenging. So yeah, that's a kind of a peek into what it's like at IDEO.
Thank you. Well, I don't think I overpromised when I said this is exactly the kind of thing that this course is about. We have some minor vocabulary differences, but it's exactly the same enterprise. And actually, several of your slides, which we can talk about, well, they get at the thing that I hoped most to talk about, which is the process itself, as opposed to most of the guests we've had thus far. We've had a couple. Karen Kaplan of Hill Holliday was great. Mm-hmm. But mostly we're seeing applications of how design thinking actually rears its head in lots of areas that people often don't think of, first off, in engineers' labs and so forth. But I do really, really like the focus on the process. And because IDEO, which I will now pronounce correctly. IDEO, as opposed to IDEO.
I pronounced it wrong for years.
Well, then somebody's going to later say, there's a couple of other pronunciation options when you have 4 letters like that.
There
but
are.
In any case, I'm curious, this may seem like an unusual first question, but I'm curious about how much you go into the process when you're talking with a new client. In other words, You know, because sometimes I imagine, much as clients in other creative practices like architecture, there's a kind of value to the client thinking, no, it's just magic, right? We're going to pay you a lot of money because you guys have the magic to do this. You have a different conversation with your own prospective employees, but so how do you talk about the process?
When we talk to clients. Well, it's a combination of both of those things. I mean, we often lay out the process, right? And I'm a person probably mostly involved in these client conversations. They have a challenge. They'll come to us with some type of challenge. We usually spend a little while actually unpacking the challenge because it's very rare that they've actually come to us with the problem they actually want to solve, right? Like for, you know, we're working with U.S. Immigration now on creating a set of digital tools for, you know, getting immigration services better. And the problem they came to us with 4 years ago was that they get 14 million calls a year in their call centers, and they wanted to re-engineer the structure of their automated call center, right? And we were like, I don't know, how about you maybe make it clearer so people call less, right? And so that's kind of how it goes. So we'll spend a while unpacking the question. And then we are very rigorous about it. We'll say it's going to be 20 weeks. These are the processes we're going to follow. This is what you're going to get at the end of these phases. We schedule in meetings. But one of the more important things we do when we talk to them about process is we talk to them about how they are going to feel during that process. And we kind of map it out because we're going to be like, you're going to get really excited here. And you're going to be terrified here that like we are not going to come up with anything and you have wasted $1 million, right? And so we try to prepare them for the like emotional journey because there is still magic. Like it's still in hiring talented people. And so there's parts of it where it is much more mysterious, right? But we try to make it as clear as we can so that people know what to expect when they're going in.
Well, first of all, that's great, and that layer of empathy that you just described is one that I've actually never heard anyone else talk about before. The idea of preparing a client for how they're going to feel through the process, which is but it's very true, isn't it? That it is this sort of creative process in the business world is particularly, I think, an emotional one. That is the expectations or the feelings that someone could have, let's say, when they are imagining the creative possibilities that an architect might provide to them in the design of new space. The excitement gets sort of into the stratosphere, and then there are other stages in the process as well. So that's super enlightening. How do you, and this is maybe a more prosaic question, but how do you talk about the value proposition that IDEO brings to these various enterprises, whether it is in their more traditional world of product design or in this newer one of experience design? And we're touching on both of them. We're having an experienced designer from Mad Pow later this semester, and they're going to actually everyone in this class is going to do an experience map, which will be, I think, very clarifying.
So, yeah, how do we talk about value? Well, sometimes you can point to value, right? We've done a lot of projects, so we can kind of look at the before of the project and look at the after of the project. We can see how many you've sold. We can do that kind of thing. But I think about it in a couple of ways. If you're a business and you're trying to optimize your existing business, right? Maybe you have a product that you kind of need refined, right? In that case, you're actually probably not going to hire IDEO. We're probably too expensive. You're probably going to hire a shop that just focuses on product design, right? Or you have a business problem, and you're going to hire someone like McKinsey or someone like BCG because you want analytics to optimize around, right? You're trying to cut costs. If you're trying to do something that's actually a different business than what you're doing, there aren't a lot of people that can actually help you do that. Most consultancies might tell you there's an opportunity here, but not actually what it looks like, right? So by having a group of people that are actually makers, we can start to make new things that push the direction in new ways, and that's where someone like IDEO becomes really valuable. There's something opening today in Brookline that we've been working on for the last 2 years, which is an example of this. So Mass Mutual is an insurance company, and they called us because they had they'd lost the direct connection to their customers because everything's sold through insurance agents. And they're like, how do we kind of, retain control of this sales channel? And at the same time, maybe shift our focus down to like people in their 30s that, don't really buy a lot of life insurance from us. And what we ended up finding at the beginning of the kind of research period was that most people in that demographic weren't even ready to have conversations about life insurance because they needed to figure out other stuff, like how do you, buy a house, like how do you merge your finances when you're going to get married, like stuff that you don't actually learn anywhere except like maybe you ask your parents, right? So instead of kind of optimizing around their existing business, they're like, you need to prepare people to even be able to interact in that, right? So how do we create, financial advisory services that are kind of more geared at people in this age group that might get them ready for that, right? And so we were able then, once we had that idea, to design all of the aspects of it. So we designed the space of it. It's opening in Coolidge Corner. We designed all of the digital tools in combination with Buku, who's a developing firm. We designed the brand. We actually shot the commercials in LA. You'll see them, actually. It's called the Society of Grown-Ups. They're on all the buses right now and all the hubway stations. We designed the business model. We prototyped the classes. We hired the teachers. They came in, and we would all take them at night and give feedback on them. So we could really touch every aspect that it takes to create a new venture. And a lot of times in larger organizations, they no longer really have that capability because of how bureaucratic everything's become. So that's kind of where I really see the value of IDEO, is when you're trying to kind of incubate new things as opposed to refine old things.
So how does that manifest itself in, let's say, just the breakdown in the Boston office? How many people do you have in Boston?
Always variable, about 65 right now, yeah.
So what would you say just generally? I mean, we got anecdotal with filmmaker, artist, and maker, and MBA, but what would you say roughly is the breakdown in terms of people's background who are working at IDEO?
Well, I would say we have, so probably, I would say 80% of the staff of the office is people that are actually, on design projects full-time all the time, which are kind of the core consulting staff. The other 20% are, people around it, people that are kind of senior advisors to those people, the experienced staff in our office that makes all of our meetings fun, right? All of your kind of other stuff that supports those people. So if we just look at those people, those kind of 80% of the people that are doing the design, we probably only have 2 or 3 people from the same discipline. Really? So, we'll have, if you just take them as broad categories and you think about business design, communication design, design research, interaction design, and product design. If you think of those as like big major categories, there's only a few people from each of those, because you'll never be on a team with another person like you. Like there won't be like 2 graphic designers that are very similar on the team. Right. So it creates a lot of challenges from a business model perspective because we're constantly playing Tetris, right? We have people coming with problems all the time, and we're like, what kind of people are best for this? Okay, you need these 4 people, and we have these 6 people, and trying to fit that together is what makes it kind of really challenging and interesting on the business side.
Right, I bet that's a real, much bigger challenge for IDEO than for most businesses.
And it does change in some of the offices based on constraint. Like, for example, like our New York office very much leans more towards brand work and digital work, simply because they are space constrained. They don't get to have a giant shop in the Soho office. In Boston, we're probably the most diverse in terms of like a mini, a microcosm of the whole firm. So we are very diverse.
Right. Interesting. I loved that you raced straight to my question about defining the problem, and we're going to have a whole assignment on that. But it can't be said enough, stressed enough, what you alluded to, that so often the people who come to a business like yours, or many creative businesses, think they know what problem it is that they need solving, and they're actually often extremely wrong about it. Like not a little bit wrong, but it's off by sort of an order of magnitude in the sense that they're aiming at something that is a consequence rather than a cause. Yeah,
exactly. That's like the immigration example, right? Yep. Like if they keep kind of putting Band-Aids on a system around this, that's not what's causing the fact that no one understands how to get their immigration benefits, right? One of the things that causes it is when you go to their website, if you go right now, It's just a list of 2,000 forms by form number. And like most people, like they don't even speak English. And you're not allowed to give them legal advice about what benefit they should have, right? So we redesigned it around, ask them a few questions, starts to filter it. And it's organized by like picture and what you're trying to do instead of form. Like I'm trying to get married, and there's like a picture of people getting married, right? So like I can go there.
Well, it reminds me, we have a business professor at the university who was a guest last year, I think, Mark Meyer, and he does this kind of consulting, I guess, more from a business strategy standpoint, but he did some work with Duncan Hines, the cake mix manufacturer, and it was astonishing because, they said, well, our sales are down and we're losing shelf space to Pillsbury or whoever the competitors were, and he said, okay, well, and so they said, Mark, what should we do? And so he did a process so much like this thing where he actually started, just went to a supermarket and asked people who were shopping in the cake aisle some questions. And he found that, that they could dramatically improve their sales if they could sell cake mix to young women. There were a lot of young women who wanted to be baking. They liked the idea of baking. However, they didn't want to become morbidly obese. They didn't want to have
the whole
baked goods all around the house all the time. And so they came up with this tiny little, basically a cupcake situation, so that you could have the old school, I can relate to my mom experience of baking and not have the problem. So I just thought this was genius, and then of course it yielded an exponential explosion in sales and the best product they'd ever had. So the whole idea that this kind of thinking that you and I maybe first got exposed to in designing objects or buildings, it can be extrapolated, so is really great. Another one of your slides alluded to what I would call the sort of fail fast approach, the idea that you try to, I like your example with the trying to make seating on long distance flights in coach better. By the way, keep at it.
Yeah.
Great deal of work to be done in this area.
Emirates and Air New Zealand, they're the good ones.
But do you find that you can apply that in other realms of your practice? Like, I know that's one example, but I mean, that seems like one I've heard a lot about it in software design. I've heard a lot about it in other forms of engineering design where we want to try to get a prototype that we can, we know it's imperfect, but what's the cheapest way for us to test the basic premise?
Yeah. And that's, people, whenever they think about prototypes, it's really easy to imagine like products or interfaces, right? Because you can like see them and they make a noise when you drop them. But we do believe you can prototype anything. And we think about like how do you prototype a service experience, right? So one example is another airport problem that deeply needs to be solved is we're working with the TSA on checking in and airport security. They're very much around kind of keeping out the bad guys, right? But one of the observations that kind of came early is, well, everyone's like real stressed out when they're at the airport. They're like running, they're late, they're freaking taking up their shit. It's horrible, right? So everyone is really stressed out, right? If you can create a situation where most people are calm, then the people that are going to do something bad are going to stick out, right? As opposed to like blend into the crowd. Right. So we're like, what are ways that we can kind of make this experience better, right? So we have like a warehouse. We put some tape on the floor. We put somebody in like a TSA costume. We put up like a sign that has a wait time on it. We test different ways, and we can kind of move them around and change them. We'll change maybe what we say to people, what the lighting is like, and you can just run people through over and over. And we'll do it at full scale for the insurance project that's opening now, the Society of Grown-Ups. We actually built a full-scale prototype out of foam core of the entire space. And we would hold classes in it. And we would also test things like a brand, right? Doesn't necessarily seem like something you would be able to prototype. But we had a set designer basically make us a blank facade. And every day we changed the logo, the signage, the branding, and then we would run people through it each day. So one day it was called like Money Love, and it was really poppy, and it had like a tent in it, and it had like red and green. one of them was around, like, it was very Gordon Gekko with like gold and black and money, right? And we'd run people through it and we'd see, how are they responding to these different brands? Or when I think even in like a service experience in a bank, right? We're doing one where they were like, maybe when people get their money, there's like a big long interface instead of the ATMs that you stand up to, right? But you can find out overnight that like people don't actually, even if it's physically connected, people feel weird about the information crossing bounds. So let's saw it in half and see how it goes tomorrow. So, we'll definitely test things like with people, right? And just acting out scenarios. And sometimes we'll do it live, which we call live prototyping. We did one with a food and beverage brand recently where we made a new type of like snack and we just put up a kiosk at an airport and saw if people wanted to buy it. Right. So that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's super interesting because, as a matter of fact, by the way, on the airline thing, didn't Virgin Atlantic, I think they're like the ones who have gone the farthest in this space in the sense of, maybe tackling the TSA space is the final frontier.
Yes.
but with the idea of giving their passengers a ride to the airport and branding the experience from the minute they leave their home or office as opposed to having that be in the hands of others.
Yeah, and actually one of our very first projects in kind of thinking about this experience design, maybe like 15 years ago in the Boston studio, was designing the Acela trains for Amtrak. Because they wanted us to do the interiors, but like the thing that actually makes taking the train great is the fact that you can just go up to it, you don't have to be early, you get your ticket out quickly. So that was one of the first times where we kind of really pushed people to think about what's the journey from when a person like wakes up and gets their ticket to when they get on the plane. And maybe the interior of that train is the least important part of what you're designing.
Yeah. Although the interiors of those are very plane-like, I'm sure by intention. And now that they've improved operations of a lot of those ideas, so that's all very good. One of the things that we said we wanted to talk about, and I think it's important too, because you guys are involved with it. Actually, we're involved with it in the architecture school too, and that is designing for change in healthcare. There is talk about low-hanging fruit, at least, a couple of facts. Healthcare as a part of GDP in this country, healthcare expenditures as part of GDP, I think is just under 20%, which is gigantic compared to any other country. So it certainly seems like there's a lot of dough in the system already. And what are some of the you shared with us the business about the diabetes treatment packet, which was not about the drug itself, but about how it engages with people. Yeah. But what are some other kinds of healthcare things that you guys are working in, and maybe that you see in the future?
We do a lot of healthcare work in Boston, specifically because there are so many pharmaceutical companies here, so many hospital groups. Traditionally when we started working in that space, it was around more kind of, traditional design-focused things. It would be around, design the pen, design the package, design the box. How do we, and then it kind of slowly started to move out, and then it might be more focused around the hospital. We did a long program with Kaiser Permanente, I think over like 5 years, where we created like a thing called like a nurse knowledge exchange network, which is basically, figuring out how to tap into the people that are on the ground in healthcare situations and get that knowledge kind of moved up, right? So like how do they communicate better between shifts, all of these types of things. So some of it is still very operationally minded, right? If you think, and we'll do that, right, for like Walgreens, for all of those people. But if you think about it at a kind of larger systemic level,
more
right?
strategic
like
kind
what are the problems facing healthcare, right? And so some of that work we'll do with government agencies. So we'll do work with CDC, we'll do work with the Jamie Oliver Food Foundation, we'll do work with Health and Human Services, right? And a lot of it at this point, is about communication, right? Because I was telling you, I was in an event on Monday where we were talking about healthcare data, right? In the quantified self movement, everyone's collecting all of this data, right? And we're like, what kind of insights can we learn from all of this data, integrating them into patient health records and electronic medical systems? But at the same time, when you actually go talk to a person, they're like, I don't know where to get a pap smear, right? The distinction between the problems people actually have. And the information that we're kind of collecting and trying to work on are actually still very different. So in terms of how we start to actually improve people's lives and help them navigate the healthcare system better, we actually think of it largely as a communication design problem. As how do we talk to people about healthcare? How do we inform people about it? How do we make it not not as complex or difficult to understand, but something that you can incorporate into your everyday life? And then how do we create the systems that can actually support this, right? So it informs every aspect of society. Like I think about a project we did recently with the San Francisco School District, right? And so they're looking at childhood obesity as a health problem in the country, right? And so they're like, okay, let's work on our school lunches, right? So they hired like the best school lunch provider in the country, and they have organic farms, and they like ship them in, right? We're in San Francisco. And then they spent like 2 years doing that, and then they realized that there were still only 15% of the people that even got the lunch for free that were eating it, right? So the least important problem was the food. And you think about, you go to a restaurant, like there's all sorts of other experiential things around it. So we ended up thinking about how do you break down behaviors in kind of the K through 12? What do you want people to do and learn? And what are the things you want them to learn about healthy eating in those times in their lives? And then how do we create experiences within a lunchroom that do that, right? Like, do you serve for children that are young? Do you serve them communally? Do you have them serve each other so that they try other things? But that all of that kind of stuff isn't going to work if we didn't also figure out what the distribution network for the warehousing for the food was, right? And create a business model that did that. So a lot of our issues around health, I think, are increasingly interconnected, and they require a lot of different kinds of parties to work on them. So most of that, I think, is pushing towards the public sector. Now, there will be a lot to do with data. People are very interested in what to do with healthcare data, how to kind of figure out things from that going forward, but they haven't really created a value proposition for that yet, or for a need.
Well, this is super interesting because, one of the things we haven't talked about with regard to your work and even your career very much is the really, for my money, almost unique dual exposure to private sector for-profit enterprises, and then a real kind of commitment and experience in public sector stuff as well. And I think you're very right to break down the healthcare problems. They're very different. I mean, there's lots of, more than this, but certainly the problem of how does the average American access his or her primary health care, let's just say. Not getting hit by a car, but the primary health care, they're getting a pap smear, they're getting your physical, whatever. And versus Sanofi or one of the companies in Cambridge, one of the pharmaceutical companies in Cambridge, that is trying to address, trying to make as much off of their investment in research on a given drug as they can. Hugely different challenges. But both might hire IDEA.
Yes, exactly. And one of the areas I'm actually really excited about that's kind of starting to blend this public-private sector is actually healthcare and the Veterans Administration. So that's been in the news a lot. There are people that the country should be taking care of, and they've kind of failed in a lot of ways. And the new head of the Veterans Administration is this guy, Bob McDonald, who used to be the CEO of Procter & Gamble, who we've worked with a lot of times there. And one of the things we've been talking to him about a lot lately is when you get into these huge systems, right, like the healthcare system in America, eventually the system starts designing for itself. Right? You create things that serve the bureaucracy instead of things that serve the actual people you're trying to serve. So his mission is how do I reorient this around the veteran, right? Because we've created all of these things that help us as an organization get around all of our crazy rules, but what are we actually supposed to be doing? And as you get larger and larger organizations, because it's very hard to solve and very hard to move.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and I'm delighted. Some people there was some anguish in the news when a guy with a corporate background was hired to take over this major public enterprise. But it seems to me actually probably exactly the right kind of person as opposed to somebody who's used to serving a bureaucracy.
Yeah, he went to West Point. He's a veteran.
You know, some of the, just some of the things, I just want to revisit a couple of things that you talked about in your talk because they're so good. One is, and this is something that all of us, I think, can relate to. I loved the images too. You always have to have good images to sell your point. But deferring judgment. This is probably the hardest thing that you talked about in terms of translating these lessons into our own creative lives. I can't tell you how often it is the case that architecture students, for example, you know, they latch on to an idea, any idea. Oh my God, thank goodness I had an idea. That's my idea. I was terrified when I got up this morning that I wouldn't even have an idea and that I would be called out for not having an idea. I've now had one. That's going to be my idea. When in fact, this is the moment in time when you need to be broadening, to use your diagram, and coming up with as many. As I loved your point that it's almost always the case that the team that is asked to do 100 ideas gets the good idea as opposed to the other
Like,
one.
let's figure out the one. Yeah, and I mean, we'll do an exercise because a lot of times we'll do, you know, we might do workshops with corporate clients that are trying to, you know, inject a little bit of this into their organization. And one of the exercises we'll start with sometimes, so if you go to one of these, you'll already know the answer, but we'll give out these sheets of paper and they have like 30 circles on them, right? And we'll give people 20 seconds and we'll be like, draw as many objects as you can in these 20 circles, right? And that's like the warm-up that we'll do. And like most people get between like 5 and 10, right?
Right.
Every single child will fill all 30, right? Because they'll just make the same thing 30 times. They'll make 100 smiley faces. They'll make 20 things. They'll draw them together into a thing. Like, they don't care, right? Whereas, like, the adults are immediately trying to think, okay, I'm going to show these people these better be good. Oh, no, does that really fit into that? Like, you have all of these self-limiting things. So, you know, there's very few rules at IDEO, but we do have rules around brainstorming. We have 7 rules, and we post them in every conference room. And, you know, one of them is defer judgment. One of them is go for quantity. One of them is, you know, one person speaks at a time. Right? Stay focused on the topic. You have a moderator that kind of helps break people down. So if someone's starting to go down a path, you know, you can kind of pull it out and redirect them. So having some rigor around that, because it's so easy to do, like, everyone does it, right? It's so easy to do that. So you really have to be conscious that, like, we're not doing that now and create, like, techniques to kind of get yourself in the mindset. Like, we'll always, like, warm up, right? Like, we won't just, like, go in first thing in the morning. Like, you want to do some stuff, draw around a little bit, like, get yourself loosened up a little.
See, now I'm thinking that we should have a team from IDEO come and teach us how to run a proper faculty meeting. But, which I'm telling you is not very much like what you just described at all.
Yeah, don't sit down. First rule, stand up.
Kate, do we have some questions?
As operations leader for IDEO, can it sometimes be hard to balance your duties to the company financially with the design process and the desire to bring innovative products that are potentially more beneficial to the market but more costly to the company?
Well, there's a couple of questions in there. So one of them is about kind of internally, how do we balance that in the business? And one of them is, you know, how do we balance it when we're actually creating something for a client? So, I mean, internally in the business, we have a little diagram we use that has like a heart on one side and money on the other, and, you know, we try to balance those. And we could certainly be a bigger company than we are. We have great brand value in the marketplace, and many private equity companies have tried to purchase us. And, you know, we could run people a lot harder than we do. You know, for example, like, you know, I worked at McKinsey. You want to be 120% billable, right? All the time. We aim for people to be like 70% billable. We want you to take a vacation. We want you to have some downtime. We want you to do that like weird art project that you do. So we definitely make lower profits, you know, than management consultancies do. But we've kind of found what we call our financial happy place, where we like to make enough margin on our projects that we don't have to make short-term decisions, that we can make long-term decisions. We don't like have to take that project we don't want to do because we have no cash to pay a bill, right? So, and we also kind of balance it, right? Like, if there's a nonprofit thing we really want to do, I'm going to make sure I charge that finance company a lot of money, right? So I'm kind of always balancing it on that edge. And we do set ourselves financial targets, and we have to meet them like any other business, but they're not as extreme as they could be, because we're trying to, cultivate an environment where people, I don't know, are happy and feel good. On the client side, how do we, how do we choose between something that might be like the better solution, aesthetically or whatever, and what might be the more financial solution. Now, we do kind of believe that the better solution is the one that can actually happen, right? Because like if you create something that cannot be created and can only be made for one person, like that thing is useless. So that's why we think about the lenses at the beginning. Like it has to be all three. It does have to have some business viability. But we'll often like make those decisions alongside our clients. Like you always have to make those decisions. We'll make a conceptual design, right? And then we'll fly out to China with them and we'll talk to the manufacturers and they'll be like, okay, like this is the materiality we can get in this color, and we kind of pick those things on the line. And you help the client make choices as they get closer to market. But there's other things that you can do to that, right? You might be creating something that's of greater value, so you can charge more for it. But one of the reasons why we have people that have MBAs that we call business designers on projects is because you need to make trade-offs about that. Does this get 5 LEDs or 4 LEDs, right? It kind of depends. But we try to get clients not to compromise on things that we really think denote quality. Like we actually have a team right now working on a smart home security system. And the leader of the project was talking to the owners of the company, and he's like, there's this like one type of like pivoting edge, and he's like, you're gonna be mad at me for caring about it, but like I promise, like I'll show you, you won't even see, but like I'll show you one that has it and one that doesn't, and like this one's gonna feel like a lot more of a quality product. So there isn't an answer to lean either way. You have to work all of those things together because we're actually trying to create impact. We're not necessarily like the lone genius designer where it's like this one iconic thing or nothing.
Well, this is where what you do and what we do in the School of Architecture is so analogous, because it is exactly pivoting on that point about the scalable, reproducible solution as opposed to the single one-of-a-kind. It's the difference between haute couture and pret-a-porter, as they say, right? And it really, that's a core distinction. You're kind of doing one of those things or the other. Anyway.
Yeah.
Do we have some more? Great.
How is the design process different for your humanitarian work in Iraq with New World Design versus the work at IDEO?
Great. Good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. Well, excuse me. So the humanitarian work was set up in an interesting way. And this is one area in which the videotape might be slightly more impactful.
Okay.
So when we created this company, what I was primarily coming there was to create a transportation solution that did not rely on soldiers driving trucks places and created jobs in the local economy. So we created all of these trucking companies with tribal elders. But when you put money into a war zone, that money tends to leave, right? If someone makes like $5 million, they're probably not going to live in Baghdad anymore, right? And so they take that money and they go buy like a lovely house in London or something. So we wanted to make sure that some of the money that was getting generated from these endeavors was actually going to benefit the country. So we capped all the profits of the organizations at 10%. And we said all of the profits over 10% have to be put into a humanitarian fund that does nation-building projects around, and all of the projects have to be approved by a council of hereditary tribal elders. Right? So when I entered this endeavor, they'd already had maybe $30–40 million in this fund. And because they were all kind of primarily focused on the business, they hadn't actually come up with any ways to spend it, right? And so they're like, we have to start spending it, or else the people are going to try and take it back, right? Like if we just leave it there. But no one could get over the momentum of like, what should we do, right? And this was really the impetus behind me bringing in all of my designer friends from the GSD. And not everyone was on the ground, right? So like it couldn't necessarily follow like as simple a process as this. But I kind of assembled this group of people, and that's why we had to think about the word design really broadly, because every single one of them was architects, and we did some architecture problems. We thought about how to make affordable housing, but most of the projects that we did weren't actually in architecture. So we're like, how do we define a set of needs? And we couldn't necessarily always be there on the ground, but we worked very closely with tribal elders that were there on the ground, right? And people that kind of were in those situations. So, we were designing solutions to needs that kind of came up on the ground and came from us, as opposed to us kind of generating some of those ideas. But it would very much still be in this kind of prototypey way, right? When you're, coming up with a wheelchair thing, you don't make the real wheelchair first, right? You kind of hook it together in ways. And people are kind of willing to try things at a prototype level in places that are developing. So, for example, like when we would go hand out wheelchairs in Baghdad, people would come to us in wheelbarrows, right? And so, like, they are very happy to try your prototype because it is better than a wheelbarrow. Another example that I'll give, is actually work we're doing right now in South Africa. Because that's outside of a war zone situation, but still kind of a humanitarian effort. We're working on the scaling of health technologies in the developing world. So there's anti-AIDS microbial gels, which have like a 60% efficacy in stopping the transmission of AIDS. And it's in this kind of large plastic tampon thing that you're supposed to insert like 12 hours before a sex act and immediately afterwards. And so they've developed the technological solution, but they're like, I don't know, no one wants to use it, right? So we sent the team down into the field. They just got back from South Africa a week ago, and they went to Durban. They went to kind of a range of socioeconomic groups. They met with traditional healers. They got AIDS tested themselves there, and they made a lot of these same observations. Like, for example, people really didn't want to talk about AIDS. Even a woman they met, both of her parents had died of AIDS, didn't want to get tested for AIDS because like she didn't want to know, right? So that was a hard avenue in. But one thing that they noticed was that every single like shantytown drugstore they went to was sold out of feminine hygiene douches because they were obsessed with like kind of hygiene and cleanliness, right? So like maybe we're approaching this from the wrong direction. How do we start to kind of lead into that? And even weird stuff. This is for adult audiences, and I'll say. So like even weird things, right? Like it's a gel, so people are like, well, maybe we can sell it because of pleasure, right? That it'll make it a better experience. Well, it turns out that in this particular area that they're doing the study in, if you're particularly well lubricated when your boyfriend comes over, it means that you're cheating on them. So women would actually dry themselves with newspaper so it would seem like they weren't cheating on their boyfriends, right? So things that you would think are solutions that make rational sense, like you don't really know the cultural context on the ground.
Empathy.
Yeah, and you approach it from the same way, right? You try and observe what people are happening in the world, and you try and not look down on them just because, they don't have money.
Right. Interesting, wow. One more?
It's believed the core value IDEO embodies is humanity, which stems into empathy, the first and crucial step of the design process. Do you encourage your clients and businesses to pursue that ordeal over profit, even in their business operations?
Again, I don't find those things in conflict, right? We do ask our clients to come in with us into the field. They don't always come with us because you don't want to overwhelm a person. If you're visiting someone in their house and ask them to like inject medication, you don't want to bring 20 people. They're going to feel weird. But we always try to bring clients into the field with us as much as possible because that way they understand where the design solutions came from. And there is often, and we deal with this all the time, there's a tendency to make like the client the enemy of the user. To be like, oh, well, this is what the user wants, but the client's not going to do that because they have all of this like money, right? And they want to do this and this. And so finding the solution between the two is like really what the difference is between like art and design, right? You're designing against a set of constraints, and you can always find solutions that are driven by empathy that still work within business constraints. And if you can get the people in the organization to understand why those decisions were made because they were in the field with you and why it might be better to go in this direction instead of this direction. They can become advocates for that design after you leave. And they may choose to kind of shift things around, use a more expensive piece here because of this or something like that. But we do try and build that same empathy into our clients so that those things are aligned.
That's really great. And this business, especially for those of us who are coming from the architecture side of the world, I mentioned this guy, Peter Dixon, who's a creative director at Profit in New York and just an excellent designer, an excellent sort of consultant. He said the single word that changed his whole professional life was empathy. And I totally get it, because the distinction you just described between art and design hinges right on that thing. And the scalable thing comes from that. The idea that you can that once you can solve a prototypical problem, you can solve more. Anyway, well, I think maybe with that, I would like to thank Heather for joining us.